Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, as Trump continues to melt down and Germany's Merz finds himself hamstrung by contradictory statements on escalation, Russia is continuing to be ever more focused on ending the conflict via Ukraine's full and outright capitulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, is tied in with what we were discussing last time, but there's more developments. And really, it's absolutely self-evident that Trump is melting down because he had so much high expectations of what he was going to do, how he was going to end the war. We've said all this before, so we don't need to repeat it. But he came out with a statement which exemplifies just the position he finds himself in, and he's trying to, in essence, almost make a veiled threat that, if Putin doesn't start towing the line, there could be problems. Because he said what Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire. Well, frankly, this is a ridiculous statement because what exactly is even the most gung-ho elements within his administration or in the Beltway going to do exactly with respect to Russia? They're going to impose more sanctions, another, 30,000 or whatever. All of them have failed. They don't work. The United States is going to give Ukraine the military capability to fire long-range missiles into Ukraine where that could cause huge devastation? Absolutely not, because they all know that's crossing a red line. And the red line being that's then tantamount to a declaration of World War III. And we, unlike many other people, have made this point for over 3 years. That's never going to happen because the United States never wants to go to war with Russia directly unless Russia launched a preemptive strike on the United States, which is never going to happen. So that's understood by both countries. So what exactly is Trump trying to suggest by this? Now, it could just be a throwaway remark because he's frustrated, because things aren't going the way he expects them to, because we're back to the fact he thinks talking to Putin on the phone means they're friends and they're not friends because the United States supports Ukraine. Ukraine's an enemy. The United States remains an enemy. So if he really thinks that he's inferring by that, well, I'm keeping the wolves at bay who are gunning for you. And he's just making idle threats because the Russians know full well no one in the United States is going to do anything. And he just thinks, well, if I threaten Putin or make these veiled references to being threatening Russia, that somehow Putin's going to capitulate. And he's going to go, oh, I'm really sorry. I know. Yeah, let's have an instant ceasefire. I know. I agree. We'll give up all the territory that we regard now as being part of the Russian Federation, meaning, of course, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, of course, Crimea by definition. And we're just going to roll over and we're going to pretend the war never happened and we're going to lick our wounds and go home as victors and then have to face the wrath of the Russian people who are not going to accept in any way, shape, or form that as the outcome of this war because they don't regard shedding the blood they have that to be an acceptable outcome. And if in any case, Russia's winning the war hands down. That's irrefutable. So this is just total meltdown. This is the situation where a standing US president realizes he's got nothing left to offer. Whatever he says is not going to change the minds of the Russians. He can't change the minds of Zelensky. Zelensky is an intractable object who equally is adamant the war only can end with Russia leaving Ukraine in totality and basically acting like Ukraine's the victor. And if his position's intractable, and the Russians have made their position abundantly clear that in no way, shape, or form is the war ending unless the core issues are dealt with. And we come back to the fundamental point. That includes those who are really legitimately running a Ukraine nation, because the Ukraine government really doesn't exist anymore. Zelensky isn't really the president of Ukraine. And until those objectives are met, and I know we're repeating ourselves a little bit, but we have to reinforce this point, then the war continues. So Trump, I think, and the Americans finally realize, oh, we thought we could just sort of bully both sides into submission. They'd both agree to end the war. The war ends. Then we look like the heroes because me, Donald Trump, and I ended the war between these two countries, because the United States, in reality, doesn't want the war carrying on anymore. It's too much of a millstone around their necks. It's not something they can affect any positive outcome. And they're kind of increasingly realizing that the wars cost them dearly and they're never going to get this money back, because this minerals deal sounds great in principle. In practice, it'll never work. And I think everybody knows that, not least because, do these minerals actually exist? A lot of the data's from the 50s, 60s. How accurate is it? Nobody can tell. And, and who's going to spend huge sums of money trying to determine whether these mineral or these resources are actually economically viable? Well, no one knows. So the US has got a situation where if the war doesn't end and the war carries on, then because they want to project this idea that we're still the hegemonic power, then we're the ones who have to find a solution to this. They can't. But if they walked away from it now and said, well, we're giving up, we're basically throwing in the towel, then that tells the rest of the world they are indeed the emperor with no clothes. They are indeed a nation who could never defeat the Russians militarily. It would make the United States look extremely weak. It would embolden the global South countries, who would finally then say, yes, the United States is finished as an hegemonic power. It's finished as being the exorbitant privilege and nation, and it would just be devastating. Never mind how devastating it would be for Trump himself and the Trump administration in terms of popular support. I mean, it would have a crushing blow to his administration. It would probably mean by the midterms, he would be a total lame duck president. They would lose the Senate and the House irrefutably. The backlash would be enormous. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They have no room for maneuver. And from my perspective, his comment, Trump, is just meltdown. He has nothing left to give. He makes idle threats that mean nothing. And what was Putin's almost immediate response to this? A continuation of the war or the special military operation, with enormous missile strike in at least a dozen regions, stretching from Kharkov in the east all the way to, forgive my pronunciation, Zhytomyr, I think it is, Zhytomyr region in the west, and obviously north and south, so Chernigov in the north, and obviously Zaporozhye in the south. And this is just a continuation of this escalation of this conflict, which we've seen from the Russians in recent days. So the statement back was, we're not playing with fire. We're totally in control of what's going on, and there's nothing you can do to change our mind. And the only way you can help is by persuading the Ukrainians to admit defeat, because the sooner the war's over, the less territory they're going to concede, because if this carries on, and at some point the Russians reach another milestone as far as they're concerned, they're going to sit down and go, okay, here's the new agreement. As Lavrov said, it's not 4 states, it's now 8 states, etc., etc. And that's for me with regards to Putin were, and the statement to him, that's the Russian statement. Nothing's going to change, and the Americans can keep coming back, trying to persuade them to the contrary and think they can threaten them and impose sanctions, and they're not going to listen because, again, whilst they keep supplying arms to the Ukrainians, military intelligence and support, the United States remains the enemy. And if they're the enemy, then they can talk all they like on the phone, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, they're not going to be remotely interested in anything the United States says, and particularly not when they're threatening or making threatening overtures, which we know and the Russians know means absolutely nothing.
One of the more interesting things I found is in a previous podcast, we mentioned that President Trump has difficulty, especially in foreign policy and geopolitics, of the ability to read the room, see the reality of what is out there, and be able to adjust on the fly or give concessions that are necessary to try to get a equitable resolution. And I think what really emphasizes this was a statement made by the former special envoy to Ukraine during Trump's first term, who said, I am now very, very skeptical that Trump will ever apply any serious sanctions or measures on Russia. He has had so many opportunities to do it, and he has always ducked. So that really speaks out the fact that the emotional outbursts that Trump does is all about setting and establishing the brand of the Trump presidency. Who he is, he's a strong leader. He doesn't back down to whom he refers to as despots, adversaries, or enemies, and the like. And as you notice, in the previous administration, the Biden administration, yes, he was, in his mental dilapidated state and didn't do a lot of press coverage, wouldn't take questions, etc. But Donald Trump tends to want to be in front of the press every single day. And when he gets hit with a question, he's going to react in the same way. It's a public relations thing to build up that I'm a strong president. I'm the leader of the free world. I'm doing this. But when you take a look behind the scenes, when you lift the cover and take a look at the engine, whether it's the financial things going on with this big, beautiful bill, whether it's what's going on in Ukraine, whether it's demands for the Golden Dome, where has got to give up its sovereignty. Everything is done to try to promote this belief that Donald Trump is on top of everything, he's in control of everything, and that everybody in the world, just for rote reasons, has to capitulate to his demands. And I think what in the reality now is that after a few months in office and a few conversations, Vladimir Putin and Russia, they're the ones who have read the room. And they know darn well that the United States will not do a single thing. And it's partially, in my opinion, led to this escalation to get the conflict over with, do everything in its power to make and force Ukraine to capitulate. And they're not even going to worry about ceasefires anymore. They're not going to worry about peace agreements. It's just we're going to do our thing because we know Europe won't step in, the United States won't step in, and pretty much they've got the bit in their teeth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's now worth mentioning the whole subject of Merz. We said undoubtedly previously it's just hollow words, but he came out suggesting on Monday that Germany and allies like France, the UK, and the US, I mean, fancy speaking for those countries, had lifted range limits on weapons to send to Ukraine. I mean, and we said at the time this is just nonsense because he was contradicted by someone in his own party, and it was the Vice Chancellor. Then there was another statement from someone else who's in his CDU party who criticised him for his contradictory statements by saying there's no sign of Germany delivering Taurus cruise missiles. He said, because I still see no unity in the coalition and no political will to respond in any way, basically in any way, shape, or form. Then, on the back of that, the interpretation was, well, Merz's government is going to say we're going to promise Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Well, he only said about a week ago that that wasn't going to happen, and there were logistical reasons. And let's face it, Taurus missiles are air-to-surface missiles. There's no way Ukraine is going to get any plane in the air that's capable of launching those missiles, even if they had them. It's just something as basic as people not understanding. They're not surface-to-air missiles, they're air-to-surface missiles. But then, yesterday, Merz came out and backtracked and said his comments referred to something that has been happening for months, namely that Ukraine has the right to use the weapons it receives, even beyond its own borders, against military targets on Russian territory. Well, these statements haven't been happening for months. They've been going on for statements on and off for a year, year and a half, even longer. But as usual, of course, the Europeans talk a good story and do absolutely nothing. So they're already backtracking, and no doubt backtracking, because someone has got on the phone to Merz and gone, why are you saying these things? Do you not understand the ramifications of it? And then Merz has come out and said today, oh, we're going to finance the production of long-range missiles by Ukraine that won't have range restrictions. So Ukraine will be able to launch these missiles at areas outside its territory. So what this means is, no, we're not giving you German missiles, because if we do, and then you fire them into Russia, then, as the Russians keep saying, Germany, if you allow this to happen, you're at war with us. Germany's not going to want to do that for obvious reasons. So then it goes, I know, we'll finance you producing your own missiles, because then we're not going to be held responsible, because they're Ukrainian produced missiles on your territory. If you choose to fire them outside your territory, the buck stops with you. That shows, how spineless ultimately the Europeans are. And this is why Zelensky simultaneously has come out and said the West needs to allocate about $30 billion to increase weapons production in Ukraine to counter the Russian offensive. This is what this is. Give us a load of money, we'll produce all our own missiles, which of course the Russians will know exactly where they're producing these missiles, and then subsequently they will destroy them. And they won't destroy them immediately. They'll wait until they've built these facilities and they think they're on the verge of producing these weapons, and then you'll find those facilities will be destroyed. But then again, this again shows not just the absolute contradictory behavior, but because they, as usual, the Europeans like to talk a big story. They like to big themselves up. But when push comes to shove, they do not want to be seen to be threatening Russia directly, because they've been told multiple times, if you do, you're declaring war on us. We are at war with you. And you know what? If Germany did something reckless, there's one nation who wouldn't rush to their defense. That's the Americans. The Americans would say, you're on your own. You're responsible for your own idiotic action. Don't get us involved. You'll have to face the consequences. Because Article 5 is not going to apply. Because why would the United States want to end up going to war with Russia? Because of idiotic policy decisions, for example, by the Germans. They're not going to do that. It's absolutely never going to happen.
When you take a look at this agreement, that at least alleged agreement Merz has with Zelensky, the production of long-range weapons that will take place both in Ukraine and Germany, the beginning of a new form of military-industrial cooperation between the two countries. That sounds awful lot like the mineral deal that Trump made with Zelensky that really is going to come to no fruition. And with this being said, the one thing I've noticed, because I agree completely with what you laid out, that Europe don't want to get involved, that the United States is not going to come in and support them when they are the aggressors. especially of this, rather than a defense statement. But I'm reminded of what is going on now in Europe. Europe is under a transition, and you have leaders like Macron and Starmer and Merz. They're all fighting to see who's going to be the top dog in this new evolved Europe. So each one, like every other week, comes out and makes this bold statement. Look at me, I'm the strong man. I can lead Europe. But in reality, Russia is ignoring them completely and has escalated their movement to end this conflict and to bring about all of the tactical and strategic requirements that they want from this conflict. The United States is doing nothing, as mentioned before. Trump just making bold, brash statements and threats. And in the meantime, Europe is sitting there going, we've got to do something to act like our money and all that waste that we put into supporting the Kiev regime isn't for nothing. But people are waking up and getting wise to this. And to me, it's going to be more and more interesting because take a look at the political consequences that's happening. Many of these political parties, uh, Labor in Britain, uh, AFD challenging the CDU and the Greens in Germany, and Le Pen's party in France, they're gaining ground, and the potential of all of these different governments falling because of the fact that they took a stake and they put everything they had into this is really going to be telling, especially as we go into the next half decade of the 2020s.
Well, yeah, and depending on what happened, things could happen potentially sooner. But ultimately, this all leads to the point that Russia sees no way of ending this war with an agreement because, they can produce these documents that apparently Ukraine's given the Americans something about how they want the war to end, and Russia's supposed to give the Americans a list of things which everybody knows what they are anyway to end the war. Neither side's going to reach an agreement, so Russia will just continue the war, and the war will continue. And they've told the Ukrainians when they had the first meeting in Istanbul a couple of weeks ago that, remember, we fought wars for 20 years. So we can carry on for another 10, 15 years, no problem. And until our demands are met, the war will carry on and they'll just keep moving eastwards, further eastwards. So effectively, the Russians are now saying the war's going to end when Ukraine capitulates, unless Ukraine agrees to our terms. And Ukraine could have agreed to Russia's terms in April 2022, when Russia would have taken none of the territory and half the demands would have disappeared on that basis. Although the fundamental ones would have remained in place, like no NATO membership, etc. But now, it's different. There's 4 territories, well, 5 including Crimea. So we're going to take additional ones, 3 or 4 more at a certain point. And then we're going to say, are you ready to have a negotiation? No. And the war will just carry on as things stand until Ukraine completely capitulate, and then there's no peace agreement. Russia will say, this is what we're doing. And who knows by that point in time how far so far west Russia will have moved in that time. So this is doing no one any favors. It's certainly not helping the Ukrainian people or the nation state of Ukraine. And the longer it drags on, the more damage it's going to do to the Western interests, whatever people's perspective is on that. Not just political, it's economic, it's financial. And that's how things are. And, threatening Russia is not going to wash at all. Russia's militarily light years ahead of the West. The West has nothing to offer that can in any way stop Russia's hypersonic missiles. And as we said, as things stand, nothing is going to change, and we shouldn't expect anything, barring a miracle. And somehow Zelensky agrees to talk to the Russians, even though he said forbid himself from doing it by passing a law saying he couldn't do it. Well, if he decides to change that, or someone talks to them and goes, okay, we agree to this, then the war could end tomorrow. Otherwise, the war will just carry on, and Russia will just make more and more advancements, take more and more territory, and more Ukrainians, very sadly, will die for no reason other than to try and preserve the political dominion of people in the West, and also to some extent to preserve the political dominion of certain institutions, including, of course, NATO.
Wouldn't it be ironic if this whole thing started with the ouster of a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine, and perhaps it will end with the implementation of a new pro-Russian leader in Kiev? Paul, was there any other thoughts you wanted regarding this?
No, I think that's fine.
Yeah, I did think we covered quite a bit today. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you very much for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.